Greetings from Magic Mountain for the Caron YouTube audience, and also a great good morning to anybody who might be watching on live stream or on campus, and again, good morning to those of you who are here with me in person today. I identify myself to strangers who ask about my employment as an addiction chaplain. And as it turns out, that's a rare breed. There are not a lot of addiction chaplains, sadly, I think. I really do believe that the discipline that I am trained in belongs at the table with psychiatry, psychology, social sciences, wellness, nutrition. And I'm so proud to be a part of an organization that makes a commitment to a spiritual care team. And every clinical unit on this campus has access to a spiritual care professional, master's level trained, and there's ethics and competencies that go with what it means to be an addiction chaplain. Caron has pioneered a model for addiction chaplaincy, and so as unusual as it is, there are some clear things in my mind about what it means to do the work that I do. And there are chaplains in other settings. There are hospital chaplains, hospice chaplains, campus chaplains, like academic chaplains, and there are military chaplains. Those are the typical other settings. And then you do find people who do chaplaincy in other unusual sort of ministries. And there's a community and history and story to go with what it means to use the term chaplain. And if you were to be interested in it or want to study it, you would find that there are two players that emerge on the landscape of history. As I was preparing for this week, I was thinking, oh, this is so interesting. We're coming up on the 100-year anniversary of what we call modern clinical chaplaincy. And I'm sure there were chaplains probably going back thousands of years. In fact, thousands of years ago, science and spirituality were less seen as separate. So I think faith healing was a piece of the world a long time ago. But as disciplines split off in different ways, and in fact 100 years ago in the early 1920s, there was a robust commitment to develop medicine as a science. And there was a skepticism about religious professionals being in hospitals or whatever, because we were viewed as sort of the fluff and maybe some question within the medical community about whether religious professionals were a worthwhile addition. I think you definitely would have seen people speculating about whether they would want to budget for people and all that stuff. So two gentlemen, a guy named Richard Cabot and a fellow named Anton Boysen, in the 1920s, who both actually knew each other and worked together. I learned a lot about the history of this week as I was preparing for this moment. So Cabot and Boysen worked together. I was shocked because they are just as different in their influence on this movement as they could possibly be. But Cabot was a science-friendly and method-oriented thinker, and his approach to the seminaries in that day was to say that if seminary graduates were going to have any hope of finding jobs as chaplains out there in the world, they would need to have specific competencies, which today we do train chaplains around specific competencies. And so it was like could list of bullet points and describe them and provide explanatory paragraphs and then delineate what the skills would be that would go with the competencies. And he was helping to formalize what it would be to train a chaplain. And he was arguing that chaplain training should be at least an optional track within theological education. But Boysen was both literally and figuratively a bit of a nut. In fact, his emergence into this conversation came out of his own psychiatric hospitalization. He was, people who go back and read about his autobiography, speculate that he may have had an acute bipolar disorder, or more likely he was schizophrenic in terms of the contemporary diagnoses. But in the 1920s, psychiatric diagnoses were a little more fluid, and he was just thought to be a person who was out of his mind. And this is so interesting in one sense. So he ends up as a patient in a psychiatric hospital in 1920. And in 1924, they hire him as a chaplain. It's pretty daring. And Father Bill would be laughing. But because Father Bill had been a patient here and they hired him as a chaplain. So I wasn't a patient here, by the way. So not that I wouldn't have been eligible. I surely would have been eligible for the wristband. But I can somehow brag I got to work here without having come through the door that way. But so this man had experienced acute psychiatric crisis. And I don't know, don't raise your hands, but I don't know how many of us really know what that's like. To cross from what we call sane to insane is a boundary that I am pretty sure I have stayed on the sane side of the watershed. But I say pretty sure because there were times in my substance use when I felt like I was losing my grip on reality and myself. And I suspect there are definitely patients in the room who have gotten to the point where, like, am I losing my mind? And being in the state of Pennsylvania, it's 302. Again, don't raise your hands. But being 302 is being remanded to psychiatric hospitalization in the state of Pennsylvania. I think it's a 72-hour hold that happens typically on the testimony of a family or a loved one that this person is no longer safe to themselves or others. And that's like the moment you don't want to have in yours or your loved one's life. You don't want to get to the point where you have to 302 someone. It's a verb. And the 72 hours is absurd because in 72 hours, yes, a psychiatrist can usually administer enough meds to land the plane. But there's a whole question of what happened. How did the fabric of sort of connectedness that made this person somehow at least quasi-functional in the reality of which they were a part begin to tear and shred? And how can it be woven back together? And 72 hours clearly is not enough. Here we are treating a mental health disorder that is not usually quite as weird as the psychiatric. There is, by the way, right over that way on the hill, there's a psychiatric residential facility. And one of the things that I'm really glad for all of you is that you're here and not there. Because that's a different thing. It's I don't think there are a bunch of chaplains over there. There may be one or two on a rare occasion, but I think somehow it's interesting that we have chaplains here and not there. And one of the things that I said to my team in training us about here is that the work that we do here has this beauty, which is that people do end up in our care, and it's an acute and scary crisis, and yes, there's terrible worry, but the remarkable fact is that most of our patients can and do get well. So this is one of these weird in-between points where the fabric of connectedness starts to tear, but it can still be stitched back together. And there are people who will not be able to sustain even being here and end up being referred to acute psychiatric hospitalization, but that's a bad way out this door. It makes me terribly worried that the life ahead for that person is likely to be. And so here you have this guy who is psychiatrically hospitalized in 1920. In 1924, he's on the mend sufficiently that they hire him as a chaplain. Wow. And as he continues his life, I think he lived until 1965, he becomes the founder of this, co-founder along with Cabot, of this movement to encourage seminaries to train chaplains. And he has two phrases that he's especially known for that I want to bring to the table, one of which is my title for my theme for today, which is Recovery of Soul. And the other of which is that he suggests that we should think about the task of a chaplain like a preacher interprets scripture, that a chaplain interprets a person. And that the phrase he uses is to train chaplains in seeing human beings as living human documents. I realize I'm going quite academically deep here, but I do have an intention to bring it back to a very deep personal reality. Because I think, first of all, I think that's a really lovely thought. And I know I've had a lot of seminary education at the highest levels of advanced theological thought. I found it really stimulating for my weird mind. But I will say, the farther I got up in the Academy of Theological Education, the more I became concerned that I was distancing myself from the flesh and blood sufferings of real human beings. So, and to me, that gap, why would the height of theology be so far away from 302-ing people that it would be very hard to wonder, why is this contemplative reflection on Aquinas and the meaning of sacrament in the 13th century as it relates to, why are we spending time on that while people are starving, shooting heroin, dying in the street, and, and losing their capacity to function as social beings? Isn't faith in spiritual life supposed to hold us tethered to reality and to the ground? And isn't it in crisis that we reach to these things? I remember one of the most crisis-oriented days in many of our lives was September 11th, 2001. And I happened to be serving a church at that time, which is hilarious because I've gone from atheist to pastor. But I was serving a church, and that church became, that day was filled with hundreds and hundreds of people of different religious denominations. We opened the doors to the church, and there were people who just came in to pray. Because something had happened to rip the fabric of the sort of social constructs of the life that we were living in. And it was so disorienting that people turned to faith who weren't normally turning to faith, who weren't normally going. So the reason I bring all of these things to the table is that there's something wrong when you end up here. There's something wrong with ending up having to have a relationship with Caron. It's like, try to be really careful with my language, but it's just screwed up. It's like a terrible eventuality. When somebody tells you should call Caron, you should be like, oh God, has it gotten to this? And I don't mean that in the stigmatizing way. I mean it in the sense of understanding the gravitas. This means that someone, you or someone in your life, is on the edge of destruction, of personal calamity, of divorce, and loss of relationships, loss of friendships, loss of kidneys, loss of pancreas, loss of sanity, and where addiction goes to attack the body is different for different people. It depends on the drugs you were doing, and it depends on your genetic heritage. I have watched people who drank way more than I did and didn't even have the elevated liver enzymes, just seem impervious to the flooding of alcohol. And then I've watched people drink just that much and lose their mental competence. So it's just very hard to know, but it just doesn't go well. It's just not a good thing. And associated with the descent, the downward spiral of an addictive disorder, which may not be alcohol, it may be another substance, it may be sexual acting out, it may be shopping, it may be gambling, it may be, there's just tons of ways this goes wrong, eating disorders. But as that spiral goes out, our capacity to be interconnected in a world in a way that we think of as healthy diminishes. And we go, these are Boysen phrases, we go into the depths, we go into the dark, we go into the shadow, we go into a far country. This was in his autobiographical writings as he went into schizophrenic psychosis. He used those metaphors, but I think they're true here. I think this is a dim, dark place that the addictive person goes. And the family is hijacked onto the ride. So, you may think you've kept your grip on reality, but honestly, it's pretty disorienting when you think your loved one is who used to, their world made sense, suddenly doesn't make sense. It's quite disorienting as well. So this is a tilt, not just of a person, but it's a tilt of a person in the connectedness that have been a part of their fabric of belonging. And it has shock waves that disorients those around. The function of a chaplain, as Boysen understood it, was dependent on the capacity of a chaplain to be of help in this situation, was dependent on the chaplain themselves knowing their inner darkness, having an encounter with unspeakable brokenness. And that might sound like a weird job requirement. It is. It's not a requirement to be a psychiatrist. It's not a requirement to be an internal medicine person. It's not a requirement to be a nurse. It's not a requirement to be, there's no other behavioral health or mental health or medical health profession that I know that sees as one of its competencies familiarity with where reality fragments. But I do think it's one of the greatest tools that a chaplain has, is if they know, like that edge of and will be able to go there as a result. And here's the thing. Boysen says too that it is in the unraveling of the sensible that the sacred was manifest for him. And that what it meant to be saved, which he had learned about in Presbyterian training, which is this whole thing of predestination and all this Calvinistic stuff, for those of you who have ever taken a look at any of that stuff, you can get really lost in the rules of how that works, came to have a completely different meaning when in the dark pit of uninterpretable despair, he found a way to come back to reality. This was God, in his mind, that made it possible for him to regain footing and be in relationship and no longer need to have the white lab coat that ties at the back. And so there's something sacred about this. Why do we call this Magic Mountain? Why? And this is, sidebar. Why do they call Good Friday good? Right? It's because there's something bizarrely sacred in the epitome of human suffering, and at the edges of what we can know and understand. Death takes us there, but psychosis takes us there, and the tug of an addictive craving when the person knows it's completely irrational to follow its call and cannot help themselves is, in a bizarre way, a trip to the edge. And one of the things, I'll finish here in just a minute, one of the things that Boysen also helped me understand and then brought that to the world of chaplaincy is the notion that in being willing to go there ourselves, we have the capacity to meet the other in their despair, jumping in the hole with someone gives a credibility and a capacity to begin to forge a path towards healing that no one who stays out of the depths can do in the same way. Like if you have your act totally together and somebody else is unraveling and you cannot relate and you're like, dude, you just lost it. Like you need to get your act together. That's a completely ineffectual message for a person who's in the grips of despair and torment and on the edge of maybe even taking their life. Like this is what I'm talking about. Like when depression, anxiety, shredding of reality, bizarre auditory and visual hallucinations, all these things start to come. It, like the voice of reason from the person who's all professionally buttoned up is of so little use. But why I want to say all of that is to say the fact that you feel like you are on the edge of losing it means that you have a capacity to be of help to each other. Because you're not a stranger to this frazzled, screwed up, the word I want to use, world. You don't have to be educated about what it means to have tilt happen. You already know. And here's the way it works. If you can't go inside and see in yourself that you have been to some then you're not going to be able to find the relationship with this other person who you care about, who's also in a place. But if you will be honest with yourself and say, yes, I have been at the edge. I don't know. I have been at the place where I do not see an answer. And then you reach out your hand in the dark and find out that somebody is there. Then in this moment of connectedness, hope resides. Love resides. God resides. As best I understand what God is, it is exactly that. It is in the pit, at the edge of life and death, is where Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism all place the sacred, at the tearing point. And that's why we are here. We came to this place not wanting to be here, but there is an incredible opportunity to see each other and be with each other in our pain. So welcome to the Nut House. I'm so glad you're here. And we have a chance to find our way back towards something. Recovery of soul. We can make it. There is reason to believe. There are paths like that on the wall. And there are people who have blazed this trail. You are not alone. Let's work together to find our way home.